Hello and welcome to today's learning session, Anatomy and Physiology 1, Chapter 1. Before we begin, one thing you should understand about anatomy and physiology is that it's a subject that you don't want to rush through it. You want to be patient and slowly but surely you will get there. And I'm going to be here with you to make sure with every little bit of step you learn something and it sticks with you. Also, stay tuned until the end of this video to take advantage of a quiz that I have prepared for you so you can test your knowledge and also prepare for your first exam. Okay, now let's start with defining what anatomy and physiology is. The term anatomy comes from the Greek word anatemnein, which means to separate, cut apart, or dissect. Anatomy describes the structures of the body. Example of some of those structures would be your bone, your heart, your blood, etc. Anatomy also helps us understand what these structures are made of and where these structures are located. Anatomy is subdivided into different categories. Let's discuss each one, starting with gross anatomy, also known as macroscopic anatomy. Now, when you hear the word gross, think of large, like something is large and big enough that you can see it with your naked eye. Like when the body is dissected, you can see certain structures without a tool, like a microscope, for example. And an example of that would be the left ventricle of the heart. You don't need any tool to see it. You can see it with your naked eye. And that's what the gross anatomy does. Regional anatomy is referred to different regions of the body. The body is divided into different regions, and some example of those regions are your head, that's a region, your neck, that's another region, and when you go down further to your chest, that is another region that is referred to as thoracic region. So the regional anatomy allows us to study those regions. Now, systemic anatomy refers to the different body systems. The body is composed of 11 systems, and some of those systems are the skeletal system, the muscular system, the cardiovascular system, etc. So this anatomy allows us to study those systems. Surface anatomy. This anatomy refers to what we can see on the surface of the body, because surface means outside. So for example, if you were to touch your chest and you would go down the middle where your breastbone is, you can touch it and feel it. So that's what surface anatomy does. Microscopic anatomy. Now this anatomy is the opposite of gross anatomy. Now when you hear the word micro, think of small, something that is so small, like something, for example, like bacteria. You need a certain tool to be able to see those bacteria. So this anatomy allows us to study, like for example, your cells and certain tissues. So that's what the microscopic anatomy is, and it also refers to, like I said, tissues and cell. And something that study the tissues is called histology. When you hear the word histology, you should know that it is something that studies tissues, and it's a science. Also, when you hear the word cytology, that's another science that studies cells. All right, now developmental anatomy, that has to do with the changes in our body from conception to adulthood. And there's another study that is under developmental anatomy that is known as embryology. And when you hear the word embryology, think of embryo. And when you hear embryo, that has to do with an unborn child. From when the baby is an egg all the way up until birth. So that's what this embryology studies. Now let's define physiology. Physiology refers to the study of function dependent on different structures of the body. And some of those functions are, let's take the heart for example. The heart pumps blood throughout the body. And if we take the bone provides protection for your internal organs. And blood transports nutrients and oxygen throughout the body. So that's what physiology is. And another thing about physiology is it does not exist without anatomy, vice versa. Because remember, anatomy studies the structures of the body, and physiology, on the other hand, studies the function of those structures. Now, let's talk about levels of organization, which, in my opinion, is different ingredients that you need in order to have a whole being. And when I say a whole being, that could be us, human beings. So, everything started with atoms. Atoms, which is the smallest unit of matter. And matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So that could be liquid, that could be gas, etc. So from atoms, we get to molecules. And these two are in the chemical level. And molecules are, you need minimum of 2 atoms to get a molecule. And an example of molecule could be water, H2O, that is a molecule. So from there, we get to organelle. Now, when we get to organelle, we are now at the cellular level of the body. And what is an organelle? An organelle is, it's not just one. We have many organelles, and they are different parts of a cell. One example of an organelle could be the Golgi apparatus, which we will discuss more when we get to bigger chapters. But for now, let's focus on what the cell is. A cell is the smallest functional unit of an organism. Remember, I said an organism could be a being. An example of that could be a human being. All right, so from cells, we get to tissues. And what are tissues? Tissues are a group of one or more types of cells working together. And one thing I forgot to mention is that in the body, there are trillions of cells. So tissues are a group of one or more of those cells working together. From tissues, we get to organs. What are organs? Organs are 2 or more types of tissues working together. And an example of that could be the heart. That is an organ. Now, from organ, we get to systems. Remember how I said earlier we have different systems in the body? Well, those systems are organs working together to accomplish a common goal. From systems, an example of a system, like I said earlier, could be skeletal system or muscular system or etc. Now, from systems, we get to organism finally, which is us, the being. Now let's see what those levels of organization look like with pictures. Remember, everything started with atoms. Atoms in combination become complex protein molecule, which bring us to protein filaments. Then we get cell at the cellular level. And what we are looking at right now is a heart muscle cell. Then we get to tissue level. Remember, tissues are a group of one or more cells working together, and this is a cardiac muscle tissue. Then we get to the organ level, and this is a heart, and the heart belongs to the cardiovascular system. And then we get to the system level. Remember, there are 11 systems in the body, and skeletal system, muscular system, cardiovascular system are part of those systems. And when you hear skeletal, that has to do with the bones in our body. And when you hear muscular, that has to do with muscles, and cardiovascular, that has to do with heart. Okay, then we finally get to the organism level, which is us. Now that we have a whole organism or being, there are different characteristics of life that come with keeping this being or this organism going. Let's start with maintaining boundaries, especially a boundary separating external and internal environments. This just means that all living things or organisms should have borders that separate them from their surroundings. Let's take example skin. Our skin acts like a barrier that keeps us from germs and also keeps water inside our bodies. Okay, let's look at movement. What is movement? It simply means that all living things should be able to move on their own or move parts of our bodies. For examples, we should be able to walk, run, or escape danger, etc. Let's look at number 3, responsiveness. Responsiveness means all organisms should be able to respond to what's happening around us. For example, if we accidentally touch something that is hot, we're going to quickly move our hands so that way we don't get burnt. And another example is we're going to blink if something suddenly tries to get into our eyes, right? Let's take, for example, we are walking in the street at night, there are cars coming and they have very bright light. We're going to quickly blink so that way we can protect our eyes. Now let's look at metabolism and excretion. What does that mean? It just means that all living things use energy and change food into fuel for our bodies. We eat and the body breaks down the food into smaller pieces and it gives us energy. We breathe, our body uses oxygen from the air to burn fuel and make energy. Okay, growth and differentiation. That means all living things should be able to grow and get bigger, and kids should grow taller as they get older, and because their bones and muscles grow as well, right? So that's what this means. And reproduction. What is reproduction? Reproduction simply means all living things should be able to make new living things like themselves. For example, having babies, right? That is a good example. All living things should be able to have babies that grow up to be adults. Organisms. All living things or organisms require five things in order for us to survive. And those are water, which is the most abundant, and it also transports substances in the body. Oxygen, so we can breathe, and oxygen is 20% of air used to release energy from nutrients. Food, which supplies energy and raw materials in the body. Heat, and pressure. Homeostasis. Homeostasis defines as the body's maintenance of a stable internal environment, even though the outside world changes continuously. What does that mean? We have about 11 organ systems that are working all the time for our benefit. Let's take, for example, our body that has a normal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Suddenly we feel cold, right? It's cold outside. Let's say it's about 10 degrees and we're not dressed properly and we start feeling cold. What does your body do? Well, you will start to shiver. And that is because the muscular system that has to do with muscles contracts and that generates heat for the body by shivering. The same way, if it's hot outside, we will begin to sweat and that will cool the body down. How is homeostasis maintained? There are three parts that are constantly communicating with each other. And the first one is receptor. Receptor, that is a sensor which is sensitive to a stimulus. A stimulus could be how outside is cold, and the receptor would be our skin, for example. It receives the stimulus, which is the cold. It feels that it's cold, and then it sends the information to the control center. And example of a control center could be hypothalamus, which is in our brain. We will discuss more when we get to bigger chapters, but hypothalamus in our brain receives and processes the information from the receptor, our skin, and then the control center sends the information to the effector. An example of effector could be a cell or organ or anything that can respond to the commands of the control center. An example of effector is sweat glands, blood vessels, skeletal muscle cells, etc. Okay, now from receptor to control center, that is called afferent pathway. And from control center to effector, that is called efferent pathway. Now, let's put everything into context. So, receptor, you receive the stimulus, your skin receives it. It's the same way how I said earlier in the previous slide. When it's cold outside, your skin receives it and then it sends it to your brain, which then sends it to the effector, and then we shiver, right? We shiver and then we get warmer. And also, it's the same way when it's hot outside, the receptor receives that information, which is the skin. You feel hot, sends it to the control center, which is located in our brain, and then it sends it to the effector, and then we begin to sweat, and then that cools the body down. Okay, as promised, here's the quiz. Feel free to pause the video so you can answer the questions at your own pace, and I will put the answers in the next slide. Okay, good luck, and I will see you all in part 2. Bye now.